I've gone back and forth on whether I should post this. Every time I convince myself to delete the draft, I remember the phrase that still rattles around in my head after all these years. Case closed, the investigation was stopped too quickly. That sentence should have brought me relief. Instead, it became the one thing I couldn't stop thinking about. I'm William. This account isn't tied to my real name, and I don't expect anyone to believe every word of what I'm about to write. That's fine. I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here because carrying a secret for years changes the way you think, sleep, and even look at yourself in the mirror. The crime I'm talking about wasn't some impulsive mistake made in a burst of anger. It wasn't glamorous, either. There were no movie-style masterminds, no dramatic speeches, no perfect plans. It started with desperation, resentment, and the slow process of convincing myself that crossing one line would somehow solve all my problems. It didn't. If anything, the crime itself lasted only a short time. Living with it afterward has taken far longer. The strange part is that everyone thinks they know how investigations work. You assume every clue gets followed, every question answered, every loose end tied up. Reality isn't always like that. Sometimes people settle for the explanation that fits best. Sometimes the file gets stamped, archived, and forgotten while the truth keeps walking around unnoticed. That's exactly what happened in my case. And it all began with a decision I spent months pretending I wasn't going to make. Looking back, I wish I could say there was one dramatic moment that pushed me over the edge. There wasn't. It was a slow drift, the kind you barely notice until you realize you're nowhere near where you started. I had a decent job, a tiny apartment, and just enough debt to make every paycheck disappear before it even hit my account. Every unexpected bill felt like another brick added to a wall I couldn't climb. What made things worse wasn't the money itself, it was the constant feeling that everyone else was getting ahead while I was standing still. Friends were buying houses, posting vacation photos, talking about promotions. I smiled through all of it, then went home wondering what I'd done wrong. That's when temptation first showed up. Not as a dramatic opportunity, but as a quiet thought that refused to leave. I noticed something at work that most people ignored, a weakness in a routine everyone trusted without question. At first I brushed it aside. Then I caught myself thinking about it again and again. Eventually, the question stopped being, could someone exploit this, and became, what if that someone was me? Once that thought took root, it became surprisingly difficult to ignore. I still showed up to work, joked with coworkers, and acted like nothing had changed, but internally I was running the same argument on repeat. One side insisted I was just curious, that everyone imagines impossible scenarios from time to time. The other side kept whispering that nobody would ever notice if I crossed the line just once. What scares me now is how ordinary that process felt. There was no movie-style turning point where I suddenly became the bad guy. Instead, I slowly adjusted my own standards until they no longer looked like standards at all. Every small compromise made the next one seem less significant. I started paying closer attention to routines, not because I had already committed to doing anything, but because I wanted to understand how predictable people could be. The more I observed, the more I realized that most workplaces run on trust. People assume familiar faces belong where they are and rarely question habits they've seen for years. That realization should have been a warning. Instead, I treated it like an opportunity, and that's when I knew I was drifting somewhere I couldn't easily come back from. By then, I had stopped pretending I was only entertaining the idea. I wasn't. I was making a decision, even if I refused to admit it out loud. The strange thing about preparing to do something you know is wrong is that your mind keeps searching for excuses. I told myself I was under pressure. I told myself the system was unfair. I even convinced myself that if everything worked out, I could quietly fix the damage later and no one would ever know. That fantasy made it easier to live with myself. My planning wasn't some elaborate blueprint worthy of a crime novel. It was mostly a series of rationalizations mixed with careful observation. I paid attention to schedules, noticed who tended to rush through the end of the day, and mentally rehearsed how I would act if anyone asked unexpected questions. More than anything, I focused on appearing completely ordinary. What I underestimated wasn't the practical side of what I intended to do, it was the psychological one. Crossing a moral line begins long before the act itself. By the time I was ready, I had already spent weeks changing the person I believed myself to be. The day everything finally happened didn't feel dramatic. There wasn't ominous weather or some instinct telling me to turn around while I still could. It was just another weekday that looked exactly like every other one. That normality was almost comforting, and maybe that's what made it so dangerous. I remember waking up earlier than usual because I barely slept. My stomach was in knots, and I must have checked the time a dozen times before leaving home. Every ordinary interaction felt strangely significant. I nodded to neighbors, bought coffee from the same place I always did, and exchanged small talk with people who had no idea I was carrying around a decision that could change my life. Even then, I kept giving myself chances to back out. I thought, just get through today. Forget the whole idea. But once I arrived and slipped into the familiar routine, those thoughts faded. Habit took over, and I found myself moving forward almost automatically. That's the part that still unsettles me. The hardest step wasn't the act itself, it was realizing I'd already convinced myself there was no turning back. The moment I crossed the line wasn't nearly as cinematic as I'd imagined during all those sleepless nights. There wasn't a loud alarm, nobody pointed a finger at me, and the world didn't suddenly stop. In fact, everything around me kept moving as if nothing unusual had happened. People chatted about weekend plans, phones rang, someone laughed in the next room. That ordinary background made what I had done feel almost unreal. For a few seconds, I actually thought I had gotten away with it. Then my own body reminded me otherwise. My heart was pounding so hard I was convinced everyone could hear it. I caught myself rereading the same email 3 times because I couldn't focus on a single sentence. Every time someone walked in my direction, I assumed they had figured everything out. Of course, they hadn't. They were busy with their own lives. That's what surprised me most. I had spent weeks believing all eyes would be on me, but the only person obsessing over my every move was me. The real confrontation hadn't started with other people, it had started inside my own head. I wish I could say the hardest part was over once I walked away, but that wasn't even close to the truth. The real pressure started afterward, when I had to keep acting as though nothing had happened. I answered emails, sat through meetings, and laughed at jokes I barely heard. Outwardly, I looked exactly the same. Inside, every passing hour felt like borrowed time. Then people began noticing that something was wrong, not with me, but with the situation. Conversations shifted from everyday complaints to confused questions. Someone mentioned that numbers didn't seem to add up. Another person wondered whether a simple mistake had been made. At first, everyone assumed it was an innocent oversight, and I clung to that assumption like it was a lifeline. Still, every discussion made my pulse race. I found myself listening more than speaking, terrified that saying too much would make me sound defensive. Ironically, nobody seemed suspicious of me. They were focused on solving the problem, while I was focused on hiding the fact that I already knew the answer. That disconnect was strangely isolating and far more exhausting than I'd ever expected. A few days later, the questions became more formal. Management announced there would be an internal review, and suddenly everyone had an opinion about what must have happened. Some blamed outdated procedures. Others insisted it had to be a simple accounting error that would sort itself out. Listening to those conversations was surreal because each theory moved a little farther away from the truth. I was interviewed along with everyone else. The questions were straightforward, and I answered them as calmly as I could. What I remember most isn't what I said, it's how exhausting it was to sound normal. Every pause felt too long. Every sentence made me wonder if I'd chosen the wrong words. Then something unexpected happened. Attention shifted toward a completely unrelated issue that demanded everyone's time and resources. The review slowed down, meetings were postponed, and the sense of urgency faded. People stopped talking about it every day. That's when I first realized something that still bothers me. Investigations don't always end because every answer has been found. Sometimes they simply lose momentum, and life moves on before the truth catches up. Weeks passed, and eventually the announcement came that everyone had been waiting for. The review was over. Management concluded that what had happened was the result of a combination of procedural mistakes and unfortunate timing. New policies were introduced, a few people complained about the extra paperwork, and before long the office slipped back into its usual rhythm. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the email that summarized the findings. One sentence kept echoing in my head, even though it wasn't written exactly that way: case closed. That should have been the moment I finally relaxed. Instead, I felt strangely hollow. I had spent so long expecting consequences that I didn't know how to live without them. Every morning I still half expected someone to tap me on the shoulder and ask me to come into a meeting room. Every unknown number on my phone made my stomach tighten. Every knock at my apartment door pulled me out of whatever I was doing. The investigation had ended for everyone else. Mine had simply moved inside my own mind, where there was no final report and no comforting conclusion. People assume guilt fades with time, but that wasn't my experience. It changed shape instead. At first, it was sharp and obvious, like a constant alarm in the background. Later, it became quieter, surfacing at random moments when I least expected it. I'd hear coworkers laughing about how lucky everyone was that the issue had been nothing serious, and I'd have to excuse myself before my expression gave away what I was thinking. The strangest part was how differently everyone remembered the event. For most people, it became an office story they occasionally joked about, a brief disruption that had been resolved. For me, it stayed frozen in vivid detail. I could remember tiny moments that no one else would ever notice. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor, the awkward silence after certain questions, the feeling of trying to look relaxed while my thoughts raced. Eventually, I realized I wasn't afraid of getting caught anymore. I was afraid of what the experience had revealed about me. I'd always believed I knew exactly where my moral boundaries were. Now I knew how easily I had talked myself into crossing one of them. The years that followed looked ordinary from the outside. I changed jobs, moved to a different city, and built a life that, on paper, seemed completely respectable. If you met me today, you'd probably describe me as quiet, dependable, maybe even boring. That's the strange thing about carrying a secret. Other people only know the version of you that you allow them to see. Every now and then, though, something would drag me back. A news story about financial misconduct. A documentary about investigations. Even hearing someone casually say, "They closed the case too quickly," was enough to make my chest tighten. I'd smile and continue the conversation, but inside I was replaying memories I'd spent years trying to bury. I sometimes wondered whether confessing would make anything better. Legally, practically, emotionally, I never found a satisfying answer. I wasn't looking for sympathy, and I certainly wasn't hoping people would excuse what I had done. The truth was simpler than that. I was tired of carrying two versions of myself, the person everyone believed I was, and the one who knew exactly how that belief had been built on a lie. Writing all of this has forced me to confront something I avoided for years. I kept telling myself the investigation had failed, but that wasn't the whole story. The bigger failure was mine. I spent so much energy thinking about whether anyone else would discover the truth that I ignored what the truth was doing to me. I've replayed those events countless times, wondering where I could have made a different choice. The answer is frustrating because it isn't one dramatic crossroads. It was dozens of small decisions, each one easier than the last. Every rationalization chipped away at the person I thought I was until doing the wrong thing felt almost reasonable. That's the part one wish people understood. You don't wake up one morning as a completely different person. You become that person gradually, one compromise at a time. If there's any reason I'm sharing this now, it's not to rewrite history or ask for forgiveness. It's because silence has a way of making you believe you've escaped the consequences. You haven't. Sometimes the longest sentence isn't handed down by a judge, it comes from living with your own choices every single day. If you've read this far, you might be expecting some dramatic twist, someone reopening the file, an old piece of evidence resurfacing, or a surprise confession that changes everything. Life usually isn't that cinematic. Most stories simply fade into the background while people move on to newer problems. Mine did exactly that. What didn't fade was the habit of questioning myself. Every important decision afterward carried an extra layer of hesitation. I'd catch myself wondering whether I was making a choice because it was right or because I was trying to compensate for the person I'd once been. Maybe that's why I became almost obsessive about honesty in other parts of my life. I volunteered for responsibilities others avoided, admitted mistakes that would have been easy to hide, and tried to rebuild a sense of integrity that no one even knew I'd lost. Of course, none of that erased the past. Good actions don't cancel out bad ones like numbers in an equation. They simply become part of the person you continue to shape. I had to accept that I couldn't rewrite my story, I could only decide what the next chapters would look like. These days, when I hear someone say, if you get away with it once, you'll probably do it again, I understand why people think that. Maybe it's true for some. It wasn't true for me. Getting away with it didn't feel like winning. It felt like carrying around a weight that nobody else could see but that never really left my shoulders. I still think about the phrase that started this post, case closed, the investigation was stopped too quickly. For years I blamed the system for missing what had happened. Now I see that focusing on the investigation was a convenient distraction. It kept me from facing the more uncomfortable truth that I was responsible for every decision that led me there. If someone reading this is standing where I once stood, convincing themselves that one dishonest choice will solve a bigger problem, listen carefully. The immediate consequences might not arrive when you expect them. They might not arrive at all. But the version of yourself that has to live with that decision will be there every single day, asking questions that are much harder to ignore than any investigator ever could. So that's my story. Not because I think confessing online magically balances the scales, and not because I'm looking for strangers to tell me I'm a terrible person or that everything is forgiven. Neither reaction would change what happened. The past stays where it is. What I have learned is that the biggest lies aren't always the ones we tell other people. They're the ones we repeat to ourselves until they sound reasonable. I told myself I was trapped, that I had no real options, that I would make things right later. Every one of those excuses made the next decision easier, and before I realized it, I had become someone I never thought I could be. If you found yourself tempted to justify crossing a line because it seems small or because nobody will notice, don't mistake silence for safety. Even if everyone else eventually moves on, you still have to live with your own memory of what you chose. Maybe the official file on my case was closed too quickly. The one in my head never was.